Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her during the orientation meeting on her first day at St. Michael's Hospital. We have plenty of just nurses around here, Ms. Cooper. Try not to slow down the actual doctors. He didn't know that the woman standing in the corner of the conference room had performed 17 consecutive field surgeries under mortar fire in Ramadi. He didn't know her hands had held open a captain's chest cavity while rounds pinged off the metal shipping container behind her. He didn't know that in 90 seconds she could establish an airway, stop a bleed, and stabilize a trauma patient better than most trauma surgeons. But Ashley Cooper smiled without bitterness and said nothing, because the quiet ones are always underestimated, and underestimated people have the advantage. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone overhead as she began her night shift at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday in September. San Antonio humidity clung to everything outside, but inside St. Michael's the air was hospital clean, that particular sterile smell of antiseptic, floor wax, and the faint metallic tang of blood that never quite washes out of the tiles. Her scrubs were crisp blue, her badge clipped to the chest with her name printed in simple block letters, A. Cooper, RN. The name meant nothing to most people. To the 6 people on the Pentagon cleared access list, it meant something else entirely. She moved through the third-floor corridor with the economic precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy in desert heat. No wasted motion. No hurried steps. The badge clattered softly against the metal handrail as she steadied herself on the turn toward the ICU wing. Her shoes, white New Balance sneakers with barely visible creases in the leather from thousands of miles walked, made no sound on the tile. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, that irritating electrical buzz that most nurses stopped hearing after a week. She never stopped hearing it. In Ramadi, awareness of environmental sound kept you alive. A change in ambient noise meant incoming fire, meant someone had moved closer, meant 3 seconds to do something about it. Old habits don't die. They just wait. The first patient was in room 307, a 73-year-old woman named Margaret recovering from hip replacement. Ashley checked the saline drip hanging from the stainless steel pole, her fingers moving with the practiced grace of muscle memory accumulated over 12 years of nursing and 4 years before that she didn't talk about. The full line was running clear, the monitor showed steady sinus rhythm at 68 beats per minute, blood pressure normal, oxygen saturation at 96% on room air. All good. Margaret slept with her mouth slightly open, her breathing the shallow rhythmic pattern of post-operative sedation. Ashley wrote nothing down yet. She just stood there for 30 seconds, watching the patient the way combat surgeons watch, not for what's wrong, but for what could go wrong. Moving down the corridor, she passed through the nurses' station where the shift supervisor, Janet, was updating the chart system. Janet had worked at St. Michael's for 11 years and had never asked Ashley any personal questions beyond the standard small talk everyone exchanges. Ashley appreciated that. Janet simply said, "Night shift's quiet so far," which was the highest compliment a nurse could give another nurse at 10:24 p.m. Room for 12 was at the end of the east wing. The captain lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and even, supported by a ventilator whose rhythmic wheeze provided the soundtrack of recovery. He had been admitted 3 days earlier from Lackland Air Force Base with severe shrapnel wounds from an IED explosion in Ramadi 2 months prior. The shrapnel had lodged in his brain tissue, creating what the neurosurgeons called traumatic brain injury with significant cognitive impairment. In simpler terms, it had scrambled his memory. The surgical team had extracted what they could, but the damage to his temporal lobe meant his long-term recall was fragmented, unreliable, sometimes gone entirely. His left forearm was visible above the fall line, and on it in block letters, unmistakable even through the post-operative swelling, was a name, Cooper. 4 letters. 1.3 inches tall. Tattooed in what looked like military ink, the kind soldiers get in forward operating bases from whatever equipment is available. The mark of someone who wanted to remember. The mark of someone who couldn't forget. Ashley stood at the foot of the bed for exactly 4 seconds, looking at the tattoo, at the man's closed eyes, at the monitor displaying his vital signs with mathematical indifference. She had carried him 3 miles through hostile territory in Ramadi on August 14, 2012. He had been bleeding out, shrapnel had severed his femoral artery, and she had applied a tourniquet while bullets snapped past their heads with a distinctive crack whip sound that means they are close. She had kept him talking, kept him conscious, kept him alive long enough to reach the FOB. He had squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you, Captain," and she had told him, "Just stay with me, sir. Stay with me." He didn't recognize her now. His eyes, when they opened, looked through her the way a sedated patient looks through a stranger. The shrapnel damage meant the neural pathways to that memory were fractured, possibly beyond repair. She checked his vitals the way she checked every patient's vitals, with complete professionalism and zero emotion. Heart rate 78, blood pressure 112/68, O2 sat 97% on the ventilator, core temperature stable at 36.8 Celsius. His surgical site was healing well. No infection markers visible. No fever. His systems were doing what systems do when they're no longer being actively destroyed. She began her charting, using the hospital's electronic system to log vitals, note the flow rate, document her assessment. Her typing was precise, her notes brief but comprehensive. This was where most of what she did existed, in this digital record, in entries that would be read by the next shift, by the doctors, by people who would never meet her in person and would never know anything about her beyond what these entries said. The system registered her name as the RN responsible, A. Cooper. Just a name on a screen. By 11:19 p.m., she had completed rounds on all 8 patients assigned to her zone. The third floor was quiet. Margaret was sleeping. The post-op cardiac patient in room 319 was stable. The elderly man in room 305 with acute pneumonia was responding to antibiotics, his oxygen levels climbing gradually back to normal. The captain in room 412 slept the medicated sleep of someone still processing trauma. All of them alive. All of them healing. All of them exactly the stable condition that meant she was doing her job correctly. She made her way to the supply closet on the east wing at 11:41 p.m., the moment when the night shift hits its quiet point, when the evening chaos has settled and the morning emergencies haven't started yet. The supply closet was narrow and warm, lit by a single fluorescent panel that had burned slightly yellow with age. Shelves held 4 bags, gauze, catheters, all the material infrastructure of modern medicine. She closed the door behind her and stood alone for exactly 4 seconds in the humming yellow light. Her scrub pocket was deep, designed to hold trauma shears and pens, and inside it she kept one thing that didn't belong in a hospital, a small triangle of fabric, folded tightly, no larger than a postage stamp. It was dark blue faded to gray from sun exposure and from being held repeatedly in sweating palms. The fabric was from a Marine Corps flag issued to the family members of killed in action personnel. This one had never made it to a family. It had been pressed into Ashley's hand by Martinez's squad leader in Ramadi, in a moment when flags weren't protocol and protocol was a luxury they couldn't afford. Martinez had been her spotter for 847 days. He had covered her extraction from Ramadi with suppressive fire while she carried Captain Cooper 3 miles through hostile territory. He had fired 340 rounds from his position on the ridgeline while she ran. He had kept his position long enough to make sure she cleared the final checkpoint, and then the drone feed showed the IED trigger. The footage stopped. Martinez stopped. His family got the folded flag and a letter from a general. She got this small triangle and the weight of knowing that the reason she survived was because he didn't. She pressed the fabric against her chest, her hand steady, her breathing even. In Ramadi she had learned that emotion was a luxury. In Ramadi she had learned that the second you let yourself feel something, your hands shake, and hands that shake don't perform surgery. So she didn't shake now. Her trembling was internal, invisible, contained in the place where she had learned to put all the things that would kill her if she let them touch her directly. 23 seconds later, she folded the fabric back into her pocket and returned to the nurse's station. It was 12:04 a.m. when Dr. Pierce arrived at St. Michael's, though his shift didn't technically begin until 6 a.m. He came through the main doors with the confidence of someone who owned the building, or believed he did, his expensive loafers clicking against the tile in a rhythm that suggested he liked the sound his own footsteps made. His name tag read Dr. James Pierce, MD, with the subtitle Surgical Director beneath it. He was tall, grey at the temples in the precise way that meant expensive salon maintenance, and he carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Ashley's monthly rent. He made his way to his office on the 4th floor, the one with windows overlooking downtown San Antonio, and he didn't see Ashley Cooper in the ICU corridor performing an unscheduled check on the cardiac patient's EKG strips because she had noticed something in the pattern that bothered her, something that probably wouldn't matter but that she had learned in Ramadi to take seriously anyway. He didn't see her catch the beginning of an arrhythmia before the monitor alarmed, didn't see her increase the drip rate on the beta blocker by 1/10 of a milliliter per hour, didn't see her handwrite the note that would be found later to have prevented what would have otherwise been a serious complication. All he would ever see in Ashley Cooper was a night shift nurse in scrubs who moved quietly and didn't make demands and didn't require the kind of attention that made a surgeon feel important. What he didn't see was that every movement she made contained precision. What he didn't see was that her calm wasn't the exhausted resignation of someone broken by 12 years of nursing, but the terrifying composure of someone who had already survived the absolute worst that life could deliver. And what happened next would begin to change that calculation. Thursday morning arrived like a scheduled execution. The conference room at St. Michael's smelled of burned coffee and fresh dry erase marker as 20 residents and attending physicians filed into the grand rounds presentation. Ashley stood in the corner, her badge clipped to navy scrubs, her posture exactly what Dr. Pierce had trained everyone to expect from floor nurses, present but invisible, there to answer questions about vital signs and medication times, not to contribute to the architecture of care. Pierce was already at the podium, his Armani tie the color of old money, his smile sharp as a surgical blade. He turned to the projection screen behind him where her charting glowed in fluorescent white, the captain's intake assessment from her shift 3 days prior, her notation about the subtle S3 heart sound she'd documented, her recommendation for a more aggressive diuretic protocol given the swelling in his lower extremities. The laser pointer came up. The red dot circled her words like a sniper's scope finding a target. This, Pierce announced, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered, is what happens when nurses forget their place in the hierarchy of care. This is what I call the dangerous shortcut. Someone who watches too much television and thinks they can interpret cardiac findings that require years of advanced training. The residents shifted. A few glanced at Ashley. She felt their eyes the way she'd felt IED pressure waves in Ramadi, as information, as data, as something her body registered without her permission to react. Her jaw clenched. Her hands found their way behind her back, fingers lacing together with the kind of precision that came from years of standing at attention in desert heat while mortars fell 300 meters away. Pierce circled another notation. S3 gallop is a classic finding in heart failure, but the recommendation here, he turned to face the room, laser pointer still active, suggests this nurse believes she should be dictating pharmaceutical interventions. Not documenting them. Not assisting with them. Dictating them. To me. The attending physician. He looked directly at Ashley for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for the residents to understand the message. Long enough for her to know that this was not a medical discussion. This was a demonstration of power, and she was the platform. Ashley's expression did not change. Her eyes remained fixed on a point on the wall behind Pierce's head, a target acquisition position her brain had chosen without consulting her conscious mind. The flag in her scrub pocket felt heavier than usual, as if grief itself had mass and weight. I appreciate your diligence in documentation, Pierce continued, turning back to the screen, his tone suggesting the opposite of appreciation, but let's be clear about the scope of nursing practice. You are not a clinician. You are a clinician's assistant. These kinds of assessments are the reason we have credentialing. The reason we have medical school. The reason there's a hierarchy. 30 minutes later, the presentation ended. The residents filed out with their tablets and their hierarchies intact. Ashley remained in the corner for another 15 seconds, then moved toward the door with the same steady pace she'd used approaching wounded soldiers in field hospitals. No rush. No visible distress. Just movement forward, one foot in front of the other, because stopping was not an option. The break room smelled like someone's leftover salmon from 3 days ago and industrial-strength cleaning products fighting a losing battle against entropy. Ashley had come for coffee, not because she wanted it, but because standing at the vending machine for 90 seconds was the assigned break activity and deviation from routine was how people got noticed. The machine hummed its mechanical song as she fed a dollar bill into the slot. Nurse Nightingale here thinks she can practice medicine without a license. Pierce's voice came from behind her, pitched loud enough to carry through the open doorway into the corridor where 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist were checking their phones. Ashley's finger hovered over the coffee button. She did not move. Did not turn. Did not acknowledge that she had heard him, though her auditory cortex had already processed the tone, the inflection, the deliberate public targeting. Maybe security should escort her out before she kills someone with her creative interpretations. The coffee button clicked. The machine hissed. The cup dropped into place with a metallic clang that sounded like a rifle bolt being chambered. Pierce stepped closer. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively floral, the kind of scent that announced itself in 2 rooms like a title announcing itself before its bearer. "Stay in your lane, sweetheart. You change bedpans. I save lives." Ashley selected her coffee without a word. The stream of brown liquid fell into the paper cup with the constancy of rain on a forward operating base. She waited for the cup to fill. She waited for the machine to release it. She lifted the cup with her right hand, turned 90 degrees to her left, and walked past Dr. Pierce as if he were a piece of furniture, a chair, a table, an object with no consciousness and therefore no ability to cause offense. Her hand was steady on the cup. Her breathing was even. Her eyes showed nothing. She heard him say something else to the residents, something about knowing the difference between nursing and medicine, but by then she was already 30 feet down the corridor, already 4 minutes into the shift, already filing the moment into the same partition of memory where she kept remedy, accessible only through specific triggers, contained, manageable. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was small enough that the overhead light barely reached the far corner where the extra for stands were stored. Ashley locked the door with the kind of smooth deliberation that came from having done something hundreds of times before. The flag was in her pocket, folded into a triangle the size of a greeting card, the fabric soft from repeated touching and the weight of knowing what it contained. She unfolded it. The fabric was desert pattern camouflage, the kind that hadn't been regulation issue in 7 years, and the edges bore dark stains that had never come out despite her attempts at care. Her hands began to shake. Not from fear. Not from anger. The trembling came from the specific interior geometry of restraint, from choosing not to scream, choosing not to break the vending machine with her bare hands, choosing not to walk into Pierce's office and remind him of what it meant to face someone who'd actually earned her composure. She pressed the flag against her chest, just below her collarbone where her heart was doing something rhythmic and angry and desperate. The fabric smelled like the desert, like diesel exhaust, like the last time she'd held Martinez before the convoy turned the corner and the IED made all her promises irrelevant. 17 seconds. She gave herself exactly 17 seconds before folding the flag, returning it to her pocket, checking her reflection in the small mirror mounted beside the sharp's disposal, and resuming her expression of neutral availability. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set but not clenched. Her breathing was steady enough to pass a sobriety test. She checked the time. 2:53 p.m. 20 minutes remaining on her break. She returned to the floor without having consumed the coffee she'd purchased. Friday morning, Pierce positioned himself at the nurses' station where 3 nurses were charting, where everyone could hear, where the message would propagate like a code through the hospital's nervous system. Ashley was documenting Captain Cooper's 6 a.m. vitals when Pierce's voice arrived like a storm system moving in from the west. Captain Cooper in 412 is MY patient. You chart, you clean, you call me. You do not make clinical assessments. Are we clear, or do I need to use smaller words? The other nurses stopped typing. Ashley's hand remained on the keyboard. She turned her head approximately 30 degrees, enough to make eye contact, not enough to suggest deference or confrontation. Just acknowledgement that sound had arrived at her location and required a response. Crystal clear, doctor. Her voice was flat. Emotionless. The voice of someone reading a grocery list into the dark. She turned back to the computer and resumed charting as if the conversation had already concluded. Because it had. Because the only way to win against someone playing a game of domination was to become the most boring possible opponent, the most unrewarding target, the kind of person who absorbed insults like sand absorbed water, completely, thoroughly, with zero visible disturbance. But that wasn't the worst part. What Pierce didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her composure wasn't fragility. It wasn't the exhausted resignation of someone broken by the weight of professional disrespect. It was the terrifying calm of someone who had already survived the absolute worst that modern warfare could deliver, and who had learned in Ramadi that the most dangerous people were never the ones who reacted. They were the ones who waited. Saturday evening, Dr. Pierce took his calculated next move. He submitted formal complaints through the hospital's medical records department, 3 separate incidents where Ashley's charting exceeded the scope of nursing practice. He requested documentation of her educational credentials. He had conversations with the chief of staff about risk management concerns. He began building the architecture of her removal from the hospital, brick by brick, email by email, knowing that patience and process were weapons just as effective as anger, and far harder to defend against. Ashley continued her shifts. She cared for patients with the invisible competence that had kept soldiers alive in cities that would never put her name on a monument. She watched Captain Cooper's vital signs with the specific attention of someone who had promised he would survive, and who understood that promises made in blood were the only ones that actually mattered. And in her scrub pocket, the flag remained folded, waiting for the moment when careful restraint would finally break open into something far more dangerous than anger. Something like action. The shift moved like most night shifts moved, quiet, methodical, the kind of invisible work that hospitals ran on. Ashley finished her rounds on the 3rd floor at 2:15 a.m., pushing the vital signs card with one hand while her eyes tracked the patterns on each monitor, the way a trained observer tracks a horizon for movement. Room for 12 was her last stop. She'd been checking on Captain Cooper every 90 minutes, a frequency that raised no red flags because night shift nurses did that for post-op patients, especially ones still in recovery from internal bleeding repairs. What nobody noticed was that she varied her timing, never the same interval twice, never predictable, the way someone checked on a witness who needed protecting without looking like she was protecting him. She entered quietly. The captain lay in the semi-dark, his breathing steady but his forehead sheened with sweat that hadn't been there at midnight. She moved to the monitor first, her hand steady as she reached for the blood pressure cuff. The numbers scrolled, 138/82. Not alarming. Not yet. But the trend was the thing. At midnight it had been 148/88. At 1:38 a.m., 142/85. Now 138/82. Downward trajectory. A slow leak. She waited, watching his chest rise and fall, counting his respirations. 18 per minute. That was elevated. Should be 14 for a resting patient. His heart rate climbed across the monitor, 94 beats per minute. 2 hours ago it had been 78. She didn't move. She stood at the foot of his bed and let the data settle into her mind the way water settles into sand, spreading through interconnected channels. Blood pressure dropping incrementally. Heart rate climbing. Sweat increasing. The body tells you things if you listen long enough. This body was telling her the chest wound, the one they'd repaired surgically 3 days ago, was telling her something was wrong underneath. Not surface wrong. Deep wrong. The kind of wrong that starts quiet and finishes loud. Ashley pulled out her phone and documented the vitals in the patient chart with clinical precision, BP trending downward over 4-hour window. HR elevated at 94. Patient diaphoretic. No complaints of pain. Recommend physician assessment of surgical site integrity. She was careful with the language. Not alarming. Professional. Observational. The kind of note a good nurse leaves so a competent doctor reads it and nods and moves forward. She paged Dr. Pierce at 2:23 a.m. Captain Cooper, room for 12. Vitals trending. Need assessment. The response came back, stable post-op, continue monitoring. She waited 40 minutes. At 3:03 a.m., she checked the captain again. The blood pressure had dropped further, 124/76. His heart rate was 108 now, climbing harder. His lips were starting to lose color, not the blue-gray of hypoxia yet, but the pale pink of someone whose blood wasn't being distributed the way it should be. She paged Dr. Pierce again. Captain Cooper showing continued vital sign deterioration. BP 124/76, HR 108. Recommend reassessment. Possible internal bleed. No response. The hospital was quiet in that way hospitals get quiet at 3 in the morning, when the day shift has gone home and the night shift is skeleton crew and the maintenance people are still cleaning and there's nobody moving fast because nobody moves fast at 3 in the morning. She checked on the other patients in her section, stable, sleeping, normal. Back to room for 12. The captain's eyes were open now, and there was something in them that wasn't pain. It was the look of a body knowing something was wrong and the mind not quite catching up yet. "How are you feeling?" she asked, keeping her voice at the level nurses use, the one that doesn't alarm, the one that sounds like everything is normal. "Tired," he said, and his voice was thin, reedy, the voice of someone whose blood oxygen was dropping. "Just tired." She checked his chest. The surgical site was clean, no visible bleeding, no swelling. But underneath was where the problem lived. She'd seen this before in Ramadi, seen the way a wound could look fine on the surface while something catastrophic was happening in the spaces between ribs, in the dark places where blood could pool in catastrophic silence. She paged Dr. Pierce a third time at 3:27 a.m., urgent, Captain Cooper, room for 12. BP now 118/72 and dropping. HR 116. Respiratory rate 22. Lips pale. Recommend immediate physician evaluation. Possible post-op hemorrhage. The phone stayed silent. At 3:43 a.m. she checked him again. His blood pressure had collapsed to 108/61. His heart rate was 124 now, racing like an animal trying to compensate for blood loss that the body knew it couldn't replace fast enough. His lips were definitely pale now, the color of someone who'd given all their red blood to the spaces it shouldn't be. His breathing was shallow, quick, the rapid shallow breathing of shock. She'd seen shock before. She'd caused shock, and she'd fixed shock, and she knew the timeline. In this window, this narrow surgical window, the difference between survival and organ failure was minutes. She stood very still. The door locked with the soft click of a mechanism engaging. She moved to the supply cabinet and pulled out what she would need, moving with the kind of speed that wasn't hurried because hurry bred mistakes and mistakes bred death. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Pressure bag. Massive transfusion protocol activation. She'd need blood, type O positive, 6 units minimum, coursing into him within the next few minutes. But first she had to stop the bleeding that was happening in a place she couldn't see. She pulled the leg of her scrubs up along her right calf and unsheathed the combat knife from the ankle sheath, the blade catching the fluorescent light for just a second before she moved it out of the shine. The captain's eyes widened, but he didn't speak. He recognized the blade, maybe. He'd seen weapons before. He'd seen worse. She held the knife the way a surgeon holds a scalpel, not like a weapon, like a tool. Like precision. Like competence. "Stay very still," she said, and her voice was different now, lower, harder, the voice of someone who'd given orders in places where orders meant survival. "This is going to feel like fire for about 3 seconds. Then it's going to feel like nothing. That's the goal. Nothing." She found the space between his ribs, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact anatomical location she'd memorized in medical training and then used 17 times in field hospitals while mortars fell and dust filled the air and the only light was coming from surgical lamps powered by generators that coughed diesel smoke. The knife went in clean. One motion. No hesitation. The sound it made was small, just the soft resistance of tissue parting, the breath of air escaping. The hiss of air escaping. Blood. Dark blood, pooled and waiting. She opened the cavity wider, her hands moving on their own now, muscle memory from a different life taking over. The blade widened the opening. Her fingers found the bleeder, the internal mammary artery, bleeding into the thoracic cavity, feeding blood into the space where blood shouldn't be. She didn't have a surgical clamp. She improvised with her hand, fingers clamping the vessel while her other hand worked the cavity, suction, pressure, the bleeding slowing. "Stay with me," she said, though the captain wasn't going anywhere. Shock was a kind of staying. She worked manually, her hands replacing the surgery the morning shift would attempt, keeping him alive in this pocket of time where alive was still possible. The heart monitor beeped its rhythm, irregular now, the rhythm of a body in crisis. She kept working. Clamp the bleeder. Manual compression. Suction. Breathe. Her breathing, not his was too shallow now, too quick. She took control of it by proxy, working the body as if it was a problem to solve instead of a person to save. For hours. That's what it took. For hours of her hands inside his chest, of blood coating her scrubs past the elbows, of her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, of her eyes never leaving the monitor, of her voice staying calm when she spoke soft directions to herself, pressures up to 84. HR dropping. Good. Keep going. Pressure's 92 now. Keep the compression steady. Sinus rhythm returning. Good. Stay with it. The sun came up somewhere beyond the hospital walls. She didn't see it. There was only the rhythm, the pressure, the bleeding that slowed and then stopped because she made it stop. At 6:22 a.m. the surgical team opened the door. They saw the open thoracotomy. They saw the field-grade surgical technique, the precision, the control, the professional clamping of the vessel. They saw Ashley, blood-soaked, her face a blank wall of exhaustion and control. For 3 seconds nobody moved. Then the surgical attending reached for the arterial clamp and took over, and Ashley stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides, the knife still in her right hand. Dr. Pierce arrived 30 seconds later, still in his street clothes, his BMW keys hanging from one hand. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went from the open chest to the blood on Ashley's scrubs to her face. His face transformed. It wasn't anger. It was something far more dangerous, it was satisfaction. It was a man who'd finally caught something. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and stepped into the hallway, his voice low but audible through the glass partition. Chief of Staff? Pierce. Yeah. I have a report you need to hear. His fingers moved across the screen. Another call. State Nursing Board licensing verification? I need to report an unauthorized medical procedure. This will change everything. At 2:51 a.m., Captain Cooper's blood pressure dropped to 70/40. The monitor registered the catastrophe in electronic beeps that accelerated like a heartbeat turning into a scream. Ashley stood at his bedside, reading the numbers the way other people read faces. Internal bleeding. The surgical site from his previous operation was rupturing from the inside. She paged Dr. Pierce 3 times. 3 separate pages. Each one clinical, urgent, unanswered. The phone in her pocket stayed silent like a weapon that wouldn't fire. His lips were turning blue. His oxygen saturation falling. 88, 84. 79, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that were filling with blood. Ashley moved without hesitation. She was already moving before the logical part of her brain caught up, the part that knew this would cost everything. She locked the door. The sound of the lock turning was a gunshot in the silence. She reached down and pulled up her scrub pant leg. The combat knife was there in its ankle sheath, the blade 6 inches of surgical steel that had spent more time in medical emergencies than anyone in the hospital would ever understand. She'd carried it through Ramadi. Through 3 tours. Through 17 field surgeries in tents that smelled like diesel fuel and blood and the particular kind of death that only happens in deserts. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't require thought. Thought was a luxury. Thought got people killed. She prepped his chest with chlorhexidine in 3 swipes. 1, 2, 3. The blade found the space between his ribs at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She made the incision through skin and muscle in one controlled motion. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. She'd heard it before. She'd made that sound before. Her fingers went into the cavity like they were coming home. The hemorrhage was immediate. Bleeding out around the old surgical site, the vessel that should have held intact now rupturing like a dam with a hairline fracture that had finally widened. She located the bleeder, the internal mammary artery, and clamped it with her fingers, applying direct pressure while her other hand worked to control the bleeding field. The warmth of his blood. The texture of muscle and tissue beneath her fingertips. Pain is information. Pain tells you where to look. His heart was still beating. Slow. Irregular. But beating. "Hold on, Captain," she whispered. "I've got you." The thing about field thoracotomy is that it exists in a space between medicine and survival. There's no textbook for it. There's no protocol. There's only what your hands know, what your body learned when the alternative was watching someone die. She'd done this 17 times in Ramadi. In forward operating bases where the nearest real surgery was 3 hours away by helicopter if the helicopters were flying. If enemy fire wasn't lighting them up. She'd done this in the dark. She'd done this while incoming rounds shook the walls. She'd done this on her spotter Martinez before he didn't make it, before the infection set in, before the medevac came too late. Her hands worked with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst. She packed gauze into the cavity. She stabilized the bleeding. She checked his carotid pulse. It was there. Weak. But there. His oxygen saturation climbed. 72, 78. 84. She maintained direct pressure on the bleeding site with her left hand while her right hand monitored his vital signs, feeling for the pulse that meant he was still in there. Still fighting. Still alive. For hours. That's how long she kept him alive. For hours of standing at the bedside with her hand inside his chest, monitoring his breathing, checking his pupils, watching the monitors like they were the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. The rain started around 4 a.m., drumming against the window like Morse code trying to tell her something. The night nurses rotated past the locked door 3 times. She heard them testing the handle. She didn't answer. At 5:48 a.m., she heard the surgical team arriving for morning cases. Running water in the scrub sink 1 floor down. Voices in the corridor. The sound of a new day that had no idea what had just happened in room for 12. She didn't pull her hand out until she saw the faces of the morning surgical team through the small window in the door. The chief resident. 2 surgical nurses. The attending surgeon who'd come in early. Their faces went white. The door burst open at 7:10 a.m. The resident saw the thoracotomy site. Saw her hand. Saw the makeshift surgical field created from hospital supplies and muscle memory and something that looked like it had come out of a war zone. "What the hell?" the resident started. "Internal bleed," Ashley said without looking up. "Rupture at the old surgical site. Clamped at the internal mammary artery approximately 4 hours ago. Vitals stable, O2 sat improving, heart rate dropping. He's yours." The surgical team moved like a synchronized machine. Taking over. Relieving her hand with their own. Getting him to the OR where they could do this properly, where there were instruments designed for this purpose, where the procedure had a name and a code and documentation. She stepped back from the bed. Her hand was covered in blood to the wrist. The knife was still in her other hand. She looked at it like she was seeing it for the first time, then slid it back into the sheath under her scrub leg. She cleaned her hands in the bathroom sink. Soap and hot water. Cold antiseptic. The water ran red and then pink and then finally clear. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The same face. The same composure. The same expression that had held steady through grand rounds and vending machine mockery and every calculated insult Dr. Pierce had thrown at her like grenades. What they didn't know was that she'd been trained to absorb much worse. Dr. Pierce arrived at 7:15 a.m. with the morning surgical team. He saw the evidence immediately. The blood. The open thoracotomy site. The equipment scattered around the room like a field hospital had materialized inside St. Michael's Hospital. His face went very still. Then a smile spread across it, thin and vicious like a knife blade catching light. He made 3 phone calls while standing in the corner of the hallway outside room for 12. Ashley watched him from the nurse's station. The first call was to the chief of staff. She saw his lips moving, saw the satisfaction in his posture. The second call was to the state nursing board. The third call was to someone on the credentialing committee. By the time he hung up, he was moving with the kind of confidence that meant he'd already won. He walked toward her with his hand hovering near her elbow like she might run. Like she was a flight risk. "We need to go talk to HR," he said quietly. His voice was pleasant. That was the worst part. His voice was pleasant. The HR office on the 3rd floor smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and desperation. The director, a woman named Rodriguez with 23 years of experience reading hospital politics, sat across a desk that looked designed for conversations that ended careers. Ashley sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles looked carved from stone. "According to Dr. Pierce's report, you performed a surgical procedure without authorization or proper credentials," Rodriguez said, reading from the incident report like it was a crime scene inventory. "You performed surgery on a patient at 2:53 in the morning with a knife. Is that what he told you?" Ashley's voice was level, measured, a voice trained to deliver information in combat zones. "He has 6 witnesses," Pierce said from the doorway. "The entire morning surgical team. They arrived at 7:10 a.m., Ashley said. After the patient was already stabilized. After 4 hours of monitoring. Were you authorized to perform that procedure?" Ashley looked at Rodriguez. The question hung in the air like smoke. She couldn't answer truthfully. If she told them she'd been trained by Naval Special Warfare Command. If she told them she'd performed 17 similar procedures in combat medicine. If she told them she was here under classified orders from Naval Intelligence protecting a federal witness. If she told them any of that, the entire operation collapsed. Captain Cooper's cover would be blown. The investigation into procurement fraud would die on the vine. The contractors who'd already tried to kill him once would know exactly where to find him the second time. "No," Ashley said. "I was not authorized." "Then you were practicing medicine without a license," Rodriguez said quietly. "That's a felony. That's criminal negligence. That's a violation of every protocol we have." Ashley's jaw tightened. "The patient was dying. That's not your decision to make." The words landed like a punch. Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. She wasn't enjoying this, just executing it, but Pierce was still standing in the doorway with that satisfied smile. Ashley understood, in that moment, that she'd been right all along. This was never about her credentials. This was about a man who couldn't tolerate being in the same room with someone he couldn't control. She'd chosen the patient. And now she was paying for it. "Your badge is deactivated effective immediately. Your credentials are suspended pending a state board investigation. You can pick up your personal items from your locker. Security will escort you out." Ashley stood. Her movements were precise and controlled. Military posture becoming civilian again, or pretending to. She walked to her locker on the 4th floor. Security walked 3 paces behind her, a young man who looked uncomfortable and who she could have incapacitated in 2.3 seconds if the situation called for it. She placed her cracked navy coffee mug in the cardboard box they'd given her. The half-dead succulent that Captain Cooper had brought her on the night shift, back when she was just the nurse in his room and not the woman who'd kept him alive with blood on her hands. The photo of Martinez, her spotter, the one who didn't make it out of Ramadi, sealed in a plastic sleeve so the tears and sweat wouldn't ruin the image. She closed the locker door. She was no longer a nurse at St. Michael's Hospital. She was no longer part of this operation. She was no longer anything at all. By 4 p.m., she stood at a bus stop on Broadway in San Antonio in the rain. The cardboard box balanced on her hip. Water dripping through the bottom, turning the corrugated cardboard soft and weak. Her navy coffee mug absorbing water. Martinez's photo darkening behind the plastic. The succulent tips over inside the box and she doesn't reach to fix it because fixing small things seems impossible now. A bus splashed past without stopping. Then another. The rain soaked through her scrubs. She didn't move. She didn't look for shelter. She just stood there with the box falling apart in her hands and her phone vibrating silently in her pocket, 17 missed calls from a number she recognized. Her naval intelligence handler. Calling about the blown mission. Calling about the operation that had just collapsed. Calling about the one thing she couldn't discuss, couldn't explain, couldn't defend. The phone kept vibrating. She didn't answer. Because answering meant acknowledging what she'd done. Because silence was the only communication left. The hospital administrator's door opened at 8:06 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Marcus Cooper walked in carrying a shadow box like it weighed nothing because to him it probably did. To everyone else in that building, it was about to weigh everything. He was 17, with his mother's steady hands and his father's jawline, and he moved through St. Michael's corridors like he owned them. The shadow box held medals arranged in ascending order against dark blue velvet, ribbons the color of blood and bronze and silver catching fluorescent light like a confession waiting to happen. "Mom, they need to see these," Marcus said, simple as that. Not a question. Not a request. The kind of statement that changes institutional memory. Ashley stood behind him in the doorway, and for the first time since she'd been terminated 20 hours earlier, her composure cracked, not visibly, but internally, like ice splitting under pressure. She'd told Marcus to go to school. She'd explicitly told him not to. But the administrator was already on the phone, and the words "emergency board meeting, 30 minutes" floated through the room like a detonation order that hadn't landed yet. By 9:15 a.m., the conference room at St. Michael's Hospital filled with people who'd never expected to be in the same room together. The Chief of Staff. The hospital's Marine Liaison Officer, Major Clayton Halloway, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, the tattoo on his neck a whisper of combat tours that everyone could read. The State Nursing Board representative from Austin, who'd gotten a very strange phone call from the hospital's legal team overnight. And Dr. Pierce, called in from the surgical lounge with a smile that evaporated the moment he saw Marcus still holding the shadow box. Captain Cooper watched from his wheelchair, positioned near the window. His rehabilitation had progressed enough that he could sit upright for brief periods, though his therapist sat 3 feet away, watching. His tattoo was visible on his left forearm where the blanket didn't cover it, Cooper in block script, letters dark as old blood, the kind of tattoo you get when someone carries you 3 miles through hostile territory while rounds snap overhead like angry wasps. The Chief of Staff gestured to the chair. "Captain, perhaps you could explain your connection to the nursing staff member in question." The room went silent. That kind of silence where the fluorescent lights hummed like a distant transmission, where you could hear the rain starting against the windows outside, where breathing sounded like an intrusion. Captain Cooper's eyes moved to Ashley. Recognition had been returning in fragments all week, her voice in the hallway yesterday, her walk past his room this morning, the way her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd done this under fire. His mouth moved, and when the words came, they were barely whisper-thin but they carried the weight of classified operations and buried history. Viper 6. That was her call sign. The room didn't know that yet, but they would. Major Halloway stood. He was the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure change, whose uniform somehow contained more authority than the fabric should have allowed. He opened the citation with hands that bore the scars of things the hospital would never ask about, and he read her name as if pronouncing a benediction. Captain Ashley Cooper. in recognition of 3 consecutive battlefield emergency surgeries performed under direct fire conditions, Ramadi, 2009. For carrying wounded personnel through hostile territory for a distance of approximately 3 miles while providing ongoing medical assessment and hemorrhage control. For extraordinary courage under fire and medical decision-making that exceeded established protocols in order to preserve life. He paused. The room held its breath like a collective prayer. Navy Cross recommendation. Currently pending declassification review. Dr. Pierce's face was the color of old concrete. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The doors at the back of the conference room opened, and General Patricia Vasquez walked through, 2-star, Joint Special Operations Command Liaison, the kind of officer whose appearance at a hospital board meeting meant the situation had already escalated past institutional authority. She wore her dress uniform like other people wore skin, and when she saw the shadow box in Marcus's hands, she came to attention and rendered a salute that lasted exactly 3 seconds and conveyed approximately 3 decades of respect. The salute landed in the room like a detonation. Dr. Pierce's hands began to shake. "General," the Chief of Staff said quietly. "Captain Cooper served with distinction in theater," Vasquez said, her voice carrying the mechanical precision of military diction. The injuries she sustained were classified at the time. Her subsequent civilian employment was part of an ongoing federal protection detail. She looked at Pierce. The witness in room for 12 was under active security protocols. Interfering with authorized protective personnel is a federal matter. The Pentagon representative arrived at 9:43 a.m. with a briefcase that probably cost more than Pierce's annual salary, and she moved through the conference room like someone who'd already made all the decisions that mattered. She sat across from the Chief of Staff, opened the folder, and slid it across the mahogany table. Inside was 3 years of surgical records. Complication reports. Adverse outcome summaries. All with Dr. Pierce's signature. All falsified. The investigation Dr. Pierce initiated against Captain Cooper expanded, the Pentagon representative said, her voice level as a surgical laser. Standard protocol. When we reviewed her credentials, we reviewed his. The records show a pattern of altered patient outcomes, unreported complications, and charts modified after the fact. She turned a page. 2 of the patients he reported as experiencing post-operative cognitive decline, she paused, and that pause carried weight, were active duty servicemen. Their families have been requesting clarification for 6 months. Pierce's voice came out cracked. This is absurd. I'm a decorated surgeon. You're a man who restricted a qualified trauma surgeon from providing emergency care to a federal witness, General Vasquez said. Her voice had the quality of a tank engine idling in a garage, all power, all controlled force. You initiated a false complaint to cover your actions. You attempted to compromise operational security. She closed her eyes briefly. The investigation is no longer the hospital's concern. The state nursing board representative was already on her phone. The hospital attorney was taking notes. Ashley sat motionless in the chair Marcus had pulled out for her, and nobody in that room would have known she was holding together by pure discipline except that her hands were too steady, the kind of steady that comes from having sutured wounds while mortar rounds landed close enough to rattle your ribs. Captain Cooper's record is cleared, the Chief of Staff said, and it sounded like he was announcing the end of a war. Her position is reinstated effective immediately, with full back pay and. The staff needs to hear it, Ashley said. Her voice had dropped an octave in the 24 hours since her termination. Everyone who witnessed what happened. They need to know the truth. The Chief of Staff nodded. We can arrange an assembly. Pierce tried again. She still violated hospital protocol. Unauthorized procedures. She saved a life, Vasquez said. Protocol is written for normal circumstances. She operated in emergency conditions with no surgeon available after 3 separate pages went unanswered. The general's eyes met his. You created the conditions that made her choices necessary. By the following week, Dr. Pierce's surgical privileges were revoked pending the state medical board's formal investigation. His medical license was suspended. Former residents began filing complaints they'd been too afraid to submit documentation of his falsified records, his pattern of shifting blame to nursing staff, his systematic isolation of anyone who questioned his decisions. The hospital released a statement affirming Captain Cooper's exemplary service and her reinstatement with a formal apology. The cardboard box that had sat in Ashley's apartment for 19 hours got unpacked. Her badge got reactivated. Her locker got cleaned out by hospital staff who'd seen the news and suddenly understood why the quiet night shift nurse had never once broken composure during Pierce's humiliations. She'd been trained to operate under actual fire. 6 months later, Dr. Pierce taught CPR fundamentals at a community college in San Antonio for $18 an hour. His hand shook as he demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy named Annie. Students checked their phones between compressions. He'd aged 10 years in 6 months. Ashley sat in the St. Michael's Hospital cafeteria during her break, watching through the courtyard window as Captain Cooper worked through physical therapy. His strength was returning in steady increments, his tattooed arm lifted a 5-pound weight with deliberate precision, his therapist calling encouragement like a ritual incantation. He'd recognized her voice last week. Her walk yesterday. This morning he'd saluted her in the hallway, muscle memory preceding conscious recognition, and for the first time since Ramadi, she'd returned it. The folded flag sat in her scrub pocket, where it belonged. The cracked navy mug on her locker shelf had been repaired with gold resin, the Japanese tradition of finding beauty in broken things. The succulent had new growth. Martinez's photo hung beside her nursing certification and her Navy commission, both identities finally visible to anyone who looked. She didn't hide anymore. The quiet was gone. In its place was something clearer, the authority of someone who'd survived the worst and chosen healing anyway. Cooper completed another rep, his eyes found her through the window. Recognition passed between them like a circuit closing, like history finally acknowledging itself. He smiled. For the first time in months, he smiled like he remembered why her name was tattooed across his forearm. Marcus came by after school, proud to tell anyone who'd listen about his mom, about the shadow box that had changed everything, about the truth that had been waiting in plain sight the entire time. He helped her carry supplies to room for 10, where a new patient needed someone who knew how to move in crisis, like water finding its shape, like muscle memory translating into mercy. Share this story. Honor the invisible heroes in healthcare who carry both compassion and courage. Demand better protections for nurses who must make impossible decisions under impossible circumstances. Comment below if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value. Subscribe for more stories of quiet warriors and the systems that try to silence them. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.